from? Welcome to Axel's Garage. We are out here working on Steven's Avalanche, trying to get it done so when he goes back to school he's got a cool ride and a reliable ride to go back to school with. Now Jeff here, and Jeff is named Jeff because I found on the forum, some forum, that when they made these they had a name. And they named them at the factory, and the name is on a label printed inside the bezel, and I'll show you a picture of what it looked like and why Jeff is Jeff. So that's why Jeff is Jeff, so we're calling it Jeff because he was given the name Jeff. Anyway, what are we doing today? Well, we're doing shocks today because the shocks are shot, and you can pretty much tell the shocks are shot if you bounce the front end up and down, get it bouncing, and then let go, and it keeps bouncing like that and doesn't stop within a one upward down motion. You know that your shocks are shot. How else can you tell that your shocks are shot? Well, ride quality. So since we got Jeff here, the ride quality has been pretty horrible, and we didn't know what to attribute it to. We only drove it a little bit before we wound up pulling out the engine and doing, you know, all the stuff that we did with his engine, cam, heads, and gaskets, brake lines, transmission lines, all that other stuff. We were concerned with mechanically getting it sound, and now we're working on these other little things. So there was two things going on. We were trying to get the massive Avalanche rake out of it, and by doing so, we kept turning the keys a turn or a half a turn at a time to see where it settled to, and we wound up getting the keys completely turned all the way up, and we still got at least an inch and a half of rake in it. We got plenty of room to the droop stops, so we know we can go farther. But what's our limiting factor right now? Well, when you jack up the front end of the truck here and you let the suspension droop, the distance between the droop stops on either side is different, and it shouldn't be different. And the only reason why it could be different is because the shocks, which we know are bad, the ride quality sucks, are the shocks that are shitty not extending all the way out and limiting, or is one overextending and one stopping? I don't know, but we know we got to change the shocks, so that's going to be our first step, is to change the shocks, and that's got to be done either way, whether we want to get rid of the rake or not. Those shocks got to get changed. So now what do we change it to? Well, we know Avalanches have a big rake from the factory, and we want to sort of level that rake out. We don't want it to squat, but we don't want it to have that giant rake. So we know we're going to bring that front end up a little bit. It's going to probably be, you know, at least an inch up from stock. So what we did when we looked at shocks was we looked at shocks that were designed for a little bit of a lift, and we found that Bilsteins, and we wanted to go with the Bilsteins anyway, or factory replacement shocks, which I believe are Bilsteins from the factory. They're just not labeled as Bilsteins. So Bilstein, the 5100 series, makes a shock that is good for an 1.25 inch lift. So that's what we went to. I'll link it in the description below. You can check the specs out. It might be an 1.25 inches to 2 inches, or it might be just an inch, I don't know. But it's made for a little bit of a lift in the front, and that's the shock we went with, the 5100 series. They weren't all that much money. I think they were like $96 each. I'll link it all in the description below. We have the identical shocks in Barry White. That's that Z71 Suburban, same year. That's leveled out pretty well with a technically a 3-inch lift kit, but it's leveled out well, and it drives like a Cadillac. So we know those were the shocks we wanted to put in it. So before we start messing with keys or anything like that, we want to get these old shocks out, get the new shocks in, and see where it sits with those new shocks in it, and see if that made any difference in allowing the suspension to move before we start playing with the heights of the front end. I measured from the top of the tire to the fender well lip because that was the easiest measurement, right above the center line of the hub. On both sides, I get 6.25 inches on this side, 6.5 inches on this side, so it is sitting a little off. We didn't really notice that, but as we fine-tune the height of the front end, we'll be able to fine-tune that out and to get it to sit completely level. But we did measure right from the top of the tire tread to the fender well lip, for a consistent measurement. This way it doesn't make a difference because the tires do stick out a little bit, so we can't go from the fender lip to the ground like we would normally go because the tires bulge out and the tape measure goes around and you don't get an accurate measurement. So that's our best accurate measurement that we can use. I'm going to get the driver's side up in the air, get the wheel off, and then we could get into putting the shock on. It's usually a pretty straightforward process. The only problem that you often run into is the top nut being frozen and the shock shaft spinning where you got to put vice grips on, but we'll get into that in a couple of minutes. All right, well, I lost audio in the next few video clips, so you'll have to deal with me doing a voiceover. So what we have here is a shock that is spinning. So as I'm trying to tighten or loosen the nut at the top of the stud of the shock above where it bolts through the chassis, the shaft on the shock is spinning. So what I did was I put a vice grip, a needle nose vice grip, on it to hold it from spinning. And I did spray it down with some penetrating oil, which didn't seem to help too much. It's really rusted up. And I'm going to go in there with a wrench, and I am going to really try to crank on it. It might have already happened, I don't know. But as I tried to loosen it, the shaft where the nut where it was at just snapped. Oh yeah, it already did happen. So, the shocks are going in the garbage. That's not a bad thing. Yeah, I don't have to spin that rusty nut on the rusty shaft all the way off. As soon as I put some torque on it, the shaft snapped and I was able to loosen up that top. So the top is now loose, and I can take I'm showing how I added some extra leverage using two open end wrenches together. And that's how I was able to snap that stud off the top, which is absolutely fine. All right, here I'm talking about how if you had unrestricted access through the engine compartment, you could come down with an impact or a ratchet and spin that nut off the top. Unfortunately, in most vehicles, it's blocked by the master cylinder, which is generally in the area right above the driver's side shock. The passenger side, some vehicles have clear access, some don't. These particular trucks don't have good access to that top nut. That's why you go in with the open end wrench and the vice grips like I did. All right, so we're moving to the bottom bolt, 13/16 it looks like on the Milwaukee stubby impact. I got the socket on the nut side, the open end wrench on the bolt side. I did spray it down with some penetrating oil and it zipped right off. Of course, when I put it back in, I'll clean those threads and I'll lube up the bolt. I like to lube up bolts. Why? Make it easier for the next guy, because the next guy, yeah, he may very well be you. All right, so now with our top nut broken off that shaft and our bottom nut and bolt out, we could slide this shock right out. You could see how crusty and old it is. It is not extending out all the way, and it's probably not going in all the way. That shock is shot, and that's what I'm talking about right now, the condition of the shock. So here I must have been talking about how the top of the stud on the shock broke, showing that the top of the stud has a little like flat spot on either side, so you can grab it with a wrench or a pair of pliers or vice grips to stop it from spinning from the top. And I am now taking out the new shock and talking about the Bilstein 5100, showing the part number. We'll link everything in the description below like we always do. And I'm going to take the shock out, show you what's in the box, which is a shock and the hardware. So you're going to get two rubbers, two washers, a new nut for the top, which I believe is a nylon lock nut in the Bilsteins. And the bottom hardware, you're going to use your original hardware. So I'm going to take my hardware and I'm going to clean it up and I'm going to lube it up with a little lithium synthetic white grease super coat that I use. There's a shock. It's got a nice boot on it. It's got some kind of polished finish or zinc finish that's polished or whatever to make it look nice and to be corrosion resistant. Um, Talking about the shock, probably just babbling away. And let's cut it here and see where we're going from here. So here I'm showing you the two rubber grommets, the two washers, and probably the lock nut coming up after that. Boy, I do talk a lot. right, so here I broke out the Supercoat synthetic white lithium grease. And I will link that in the description below as well. I talk too much on these videos, and I never realize how much I talk until I have to do a voiceover on a video that I did months ago. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lube up the stem and the threads mainly on the shaft of the shock. I'm going to lube up the rubbers where they come in contact with the metal on the shock mount on the vehicle and the metal washer or uh, whatever spacer washer you might call it. And everything's going to get a nice layer of super coat that so that it goes on nice, it doesn't rust, and it stays smooth. What I was showing there was that little hat part of the rubber goes up towards the mount on the vehicle, and then the top rubber will go down that little hat part towards the mount on the vehicle, and the flat part of the rubber goes towards the metal washer. So here I am lubing it all up off camera because I'm an idiot. And now I'm going to take it and I'm going to slide it over the shock. I got a washer on it. Oh, now I finally realize that I'm off camera. I'll move that camera down and hopefully it'll come into focus. Focus! There we go. Now we're in focus using the super coat quite liberally. And I'm going to take my lubed up bushing, slide it down with the hat part of the bushing facing up. So now what I'm doing now is I'm taking some of the Supercoat white grease and I am putting a layer on the lower mount that's in the control arm. There's a rubber mount where the shock is going to go over that rubber mount. And I'm just going to put a layer on either side of the rubber mount to help preserve that rubber so that it doesn't dry out from rain and road salt and debris and things like that. Now here you can see I go to fit the shock into the lower mount, but it's too long to get into the upper mount. These shocks ship fully extended. They don't have a tie wrap on them that hold them compressed like a lot of shock manufacturers do. So here I'm trying to push the top down so I can get it to slide under the cup mount that's on the frame for the shock. And it's too stiff for me to slide it down with my arms extended like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the shock back out from the lower mount. I'm going to put it on the ground in the driveway in front of me, and I'm going to press down and compress the shock all the way. Once you get the shock all the way compressed, with a little bit of effort, you can hold it compressed and slide it back in. So that's what I'm doing. I'm pushing it all the way down, getting it all the way compressed, and then I'm going to grab it, trying to hold it compressed as best I can, slide it into the bottom mount, and then try to get it into the top. And you can see with a little effort, then you just got to go down maybe a quarter of an inch, and you can get it right over the top, and then guide it up through as it opens back up again on its own, and just make sure the little hat on the rubber goes through the opening in the frame mount on the vehicle. So here I'm taking the top rubber, I'm giving it a coat of lube. This isn't something that you have to do. This is just something that I do to prevent corrosion, to prevent squeaks, to make it easy to get off when you got to take them off. I give it a coat of lube. Remember, the flat part of the rubber goes against the rubber washer, the metal washer, and that the part of the rubber with the hat goes towards the frame opening. And I'm going to slide that over the shaft and through the little opening in the frame. So I have the rubber hat on the top rubber and the rubber hat on the bottom rubber touching each other, going through the wider hole in the frame, because that hole in the frame is wider than the shaft. It is made for the rubber, and the shaft goes through the middle so that your shaft isn't riding on the frame, the hole in the frame. It's riding through the rubbers, and the rubbers take up that space, that extra space. Then I'll put the nut on top, and I will tighten it down until the rubber starts to squish out a little bit. It increases in diameter from the metal washer. That's how you know you have it tight enough. The rubber is a little bit narrower in diameter than the metal washer is, and you keep tightening it until the rubber kind of pushes out. Almost looks like it gives the edges a round shape, and it just gets a little bit wider than the metal washer. You know that you're tight enough. Sometimes you will have to put a vice grip or a wrench on the squared off part of the shaft, the upper shaft at the very tip. There's a little squared off part where you can put a wrench on it or a vice grip to stop the shaft from spinning as you tighten that top nut, because the shaft will tend to spin on some makes of shocks. All right, so here I demonstrate how to use the needle nose vice grips on the flat spot on the top of the shaft to keep it from spinning. So what I do is I attach the vice grips to the top of the shaft there, and then I'll take the open-end wrench and I will start tightening the nut down. This way it's holding the shaft back. You can see I slide the wrench in there and start to tighten it down. So I will soon get frustrated only being able to move it, an eighth of a turn at a time, and think to myself, well, I could be using the ratchet wrench if I were to put the ratchet wrench on the nut first, then put the vice grips over it. This way the ratchet wrench is on there. So what I do here is make sure that my rubber hats are through the frame and it's appropriately in there so that the shaft can't move around. That's why I gave it that little shake to make sure that the shaft was centered. Through the hole in the frame with the rubber hats, I put my ratcheting wrench over the nut in the right direction so that I could start turning it, and then I'll take the vice grips and grab the top flat part of the shaft with the vice grips, and now I can just hold the vice grips with one hand and ratchet away with the other hand. Now with the top bolt tight, I'll move on to the bottom bolt and nut, and I clean them off with a wire wheel on the bench grinder, and I'm giving them a coat of white lithium grease, lube them up. Just good practice if you live in a rusty environment. It's not a necessary or critical step, just something that I do because we live in such a rusty area. I make sure that the shaft and the threads are lubed. This way it's easy to disassemble in the future when it needs to be disassembled. Put some lube on it, make it easier for the next guy. The next guy may very well be you. I know I've said that over and over again. And I'll slide that bolt through, get the nut on by hand, and then I'll zip it down with the electric impact, and I'll finish it off with a wrench to make sure it's good and tight. Now here, what I'm talking about is the upper control arm and where it hits that stop there. I call it a droop stop. I don't know what it's actually called. But when the suspension is hanging all the way, that upper control arm should hit that stop. That's what limits the suspension travel. Now, previously, I wasn't even coming close with the shocks that were in there because they were no longer they were so worn out, they were no longer extending all the way. So when my suspension hung, I still had almost a finger width of space in between there. Now you should have space in between there when your vehicle is sitting on the ground. You should have, at least the rule of thumb is a pencil width. The width of a standard pencil should be your space when the vehicle is on the ground. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any downward travel of your suspension. You would only have upward travel. And sometimes when people turn their keys up too much or put lift keys in there and turn them up too much, that's the way the suspension sits and gives you a very harsh ride. And I'm just demonstrating that here. So here on the passenger side with the old shock still in place, I'm showing the gap that the shock is limiting the suspension from traveling all the way down. The suspension is hanging right now, and there's still a space between the control arm and the droop stop. And my audio is going to come back, and I'm talking about how this can affect ride height when you're adjusting your lift springs. Okay, so on the passenger side, I neglected to show you on the driver's side, while we still have the old shock in, you could see we clearly have about an eighth of an inch before the upper control arm hits that stop right here. On the other side, we had about a quarter of an inch. Now, I don't know if it's supposed to let it down, but this could be the reason why we're not getting the height adjustment out of the stock keys that we thought we would. It could be because the shock is either too short or it's not letting it droop all the way, because there's a problem with the shock, because the shocks are shot. So either way, we're replacing the shocks because the ride is horrible, and we'll see if the shock replacement, allowing it to droop all the way down where it's supposed to be, changes anything in the ride height. So we'll do this exactly the same way we did the other one. We got our vice grip up there, and we'll put this one in, we'll get the wheel back on, and we'll show you what we come up with.
bird shit on the fucking car already?
Yeah. That's good luck.
Yeah. I don't know what else to say.
I'm waiting for you now. I'm recording, waiting for you.
Oh. Alright.
Okay, so both shocks in. I lubed up the front end while I was down there and got it back down on the ground, went for a ride around the block a few times, make sure everything's settled in the suspension, and I did get an increase of a 1/4 inch across the board. So a 1/4 inch on either side. It's still not level from side to side, but I did get an increase of a 1/4 inch, and that was the shocks. Maybe they weren't collapsing all the way, they weren't opening all the way as you saw, because the suspension wasn't able to hit the droop stops. They must not have been closing all the way either. They're just, I mean, shot. So that's the shocks. Now we got to level it out, and that's for another video. We're going to put in a set of aftermarket keys and see if we can get this fairly level. It's still got a bit of the factory rake to it. We want to try to level it out. Hopefully the ride doesn't sacrifice when you level. Sometimes the ride can be harsh, but driving it around a little bit to get it to settle, you notice an immediate difference. Going over the little bumps that you felt every little thing, now it just kind of like floats along nice. The Bilstein, that guy Bill, he makes a decent shock, so I'm glad I went with them. I know I knew the ride was going to be better, but I mean, it's nice ride. Link everything in the description below, and as always, thanks for watching.